Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're going to be tackling something that I know is on a lot of people's minds, and that's employment taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at FICA, FUTA, and withholding to really understand how they apply, or maybe how they don't apply to you. So to get to the bottom of this, we're going straight to the source material. That's right. We're going to the Internal Revenue Code itself.
Sounds exciting. I think a lot of folks, they get kind of anxious when they think about employment taxes.
Yeah.
Everybody just assumes they're obligated to participate, payroll, withholding, all that.
Right.
But the documents we're going through today, they make a really compelling case that maybe that's not always true.
Okay, so let's just jump right into it then. A lot of people believe that everyone is subject to payroll withholding, but you're saying that might not be the case.
Potentially, yeah. To really understand why, we need to look at where these employment taxes are actually defined. And that's in Subtitle C of the Internal Revenue Code.
Okay.
And it's broken down into chapters. Each one covers a specific tax. So like Chapter 21, that's for FICA, Social Security tax, and then you've got Chapter 22 for railroad retirement tax.
Hold on. Railroad taxes. Why are there separate taxes for railroads?
It's interesting, right? It kind of goes back to, the government's historical control over the railroad industry.
Huh.
It makes you think, why railroads and not other industries?
That is a really good point. Okay, so we've got all these different chapters defining the different employment taxes, but I know a lot of people, they question whether these withholding laws are even constitutional. So what does our source material say about that?
Well, it argues that the laws themselves, they are constitutional.
Okay.
But the problem is how they're applied. A lot of times it's misapplied.
Okay.
And this all kind of stems from a misunderstanding of inalienable rights, particularly the right to contract your own labor.
So you're saying our right to work and earn a living, that's protected. The government can't just impose taxes on that.
Exactly. There's a history of Supreme Court cases, and they uphold this idea that individuals, they have the right to enter into these labor contracts freely without the government interfering.
Right. That makes sense. Now, this leads to something important, which is the difference between an excise tax and a direct tax.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. An excise tax is imposed on the privilege of doing a specific activity. So it's not directly taxing your income. It's not like a property tax. Think of it more like a sales tax. You pay it when you choose to buy something.
Okay.
So the source material, it suggests that employment taxes, at their heart, these are excise taxes. They're levied on the privilege of doing certain types of work.
Gotcha. So it's not about the government taxing our income directly. It's about taxing a specific activity.
But what about Social Security? A lot of people think of those taxes like it's their own personal savings account.
Yeah.
They think they're paying into it. Right. A lot of people think that. But the source material, it actually argues, citing legal precedent, that Social Security taxes, they're not held in individual accounts. They go into the Treasury's general fund.
So there's no personal Social Security piggy bank. That's definitely different from what a lot of people think.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's dive into Chapter 24, the one about withholding. What are the key takeaways from that chapter?
This one's really interesting. Chapter 24, it commands withholding, but it doesn't actually define a tax itself.
Okay.
Plus, the language they use in this chapter to define, employee and employer, it's really narrow.
How narrow are we talking?
Well, it seems to mainly apply to people working directly for the government, for government entities.
Wait, so the chapter dealing with withholding might only apply to government workers. That's a big deal.
It definitely challenges how we usually think of withholding, and a lot of this hinges on one specific word they use in those definitions: includes.
What's so important about the word includes?
Well, in legal terms, includes can mean a limited expansion within a definition. It doesn't mean it includes everything you can think of.
Okay.
So the source material, it argues that in this case, includes, really only refers to people already under that government employment umbrella, not to the general public.
So includes is kind of like a fence. It defines a specific area, not just opening it up to everyone.
Exactly. So Chapter 24, it authorizes withholding, but it's vague about what taxes they're withholding. And the way they define employee and employer, it seems to really limit the scope, just to those with ties to the government. But what about everyone else?
Yeah.
People with regular jobs.
Right. That's a great question.
Well, that's where Subtitle A of the Internal Revenue Code comes into play,
Okay.
because Chapter 24 authorizes withholding for taxes that are imposed under Subtitle A.
Okay.
So we need to ask, who is liable for those Subtitle A taxes?
Right. Who is liable?
Interestingly enough, the IRS itself, they've issued statements, and they suggest that liability under Subtitle A, it's mainly triggered by contracts with the U.S. government.
So you're saying our liability might depend on whether we have a contract with the government or not.
That's what the source material is suggesting, yeah. And it goes on to argue that all these forms, the W-4s, the W-2s, 1099s, even EINs, these might only be relevant for folks doing stuff related to the federal government or certain industries that are regulated.
So all those forms we fill out every tax season, those might not even apply to most people.
That's what this interpretation is saying. It's definitely different from what most of us have been taught.
This is a lot.
Yeah.
So Chapter 24, that might only apply to government workers and those with specific contracts.
Mm-hmm.
But how do regular people get pulled into this? How do they get involved?
Well, the source material calls it volunteering into jurisdiction.
Volunteering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we often do this without even realizing it. Like when we give out our Social Security numbers for things that go beyond the original reason they were intended for.
So sharing our Social Security number could actually affect our tax liability without us knowing. That's a scary thought.
It does make you think about the implications when you're sharing that information.
Right. Okay. This is eye-opening for sure. So Chapter 24 might be more limited than we thought. And sharing our Social Security number, well, that could affect our tax liability. But what about FICA and FUTA? Where do those fit in?
That's a great question. And that's exactly what we'll be digging into in part 2 of this deep dive. Welcome back. So before we get into FICA and FUTA, I think it's important to clarify something we were talking about earlier. That distinction between, wages, as defined in Chapter 24, and employment when it comes to FICA and FUTA.
Right. Yeah, that could get confusing.
Yeah, so can you remind us how wages were defined in Chapter 24?
Well, if I remember correctly, wages in that chapter seem to be talking about payments made to specific government employees.
Exactly. But then when we switch gears to FICA and FUTA, the focus changes to employment as the trigger for tax liability.
So employment becomes the key term. But what exactly constitutes employment legally speaking? Like, how do they define that?
This is where it gets interesting. The source material, it points to a definition of employment that's all about location. So according to the Internal Revenue Code, employment for FICA and FUTA, it means any service performed within the United States.
So where you work determines whether or not it's considered employment and whether those taxes apply. Location, 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 right?
Right. But to really get this, we need to understand how the Internal Revenue Code defines the United States.
Okay, so what does United States actually mean in this legal context? Because I think most people, when they hear that, they think of the entire country.
Yeah, and that's where the common understanding and the legal definition, they might be different. The source material, it cites these specific regulations, and they define the United States as including federal areas, like the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa.
Hold on, are you saying that United States, in this context, might not refer to all 50 states?
Yeah, that's it. United States, as it's defined in these regulations, it seems to be talking about those areas that are under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government, not the states in the union where most of us live and work.
Wow. This is really shifting my perspective here. So if I'm understanding you correctly, FICA and FUTA taxes, they might only apply to work done in those specific federal areas. Yeah. Not in the states themselves.
That's the argument. And it goes back to the idea of limited government power, right? The federal government only has the authority that's been given to it by the states.
Okay.
So to impose those taxes, FICA and FUTA, on people working within the states, well, that could be overstepping the bounds of their authority.
So you're saying imposing FICA and FUTA taxes on work done within the states that might go against those inalienable rights we talked about earlier, like the right to freely contract your own labor.
That's what the source material is arguing.
Okay. This is a lot to digest, but it's starting to make sense. So if the feds only have the power to impose these taxes in those specific federal areas, how does everyone else get caught up in this? People who work in the states.
It goes back to that idea of volunteering into jurisdiction. We might be unknowingly subjecting ourselves to these taxes when we give out our Social Security numbers for reasons that, go beyond their original purpose.
So even something as simple as sharing our Social Security number could affect our tax liability without us even realizing it.
That's what they're arguing. It really highlights how important it is to understand what it means when you share that information.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about how FICA and FUTA, those taxes might only apply to those federal areas,
Yeah.
and how sharing our Social Security number could play a role.
Yeah.
But what about businesses? Where do they fit into this whole picture?
That's where the EIN comes in, that employer identification number. The source material, it argues that all these tax forms and identifiers, the W-4s, W-2s, EINs, they're mainly for people and entities involved with the federal government or for those in specific regulated industries.
Okay.
So if a business operates in the private sector, without any government contracts or involvement in those federally regulated activities, it's possible they don't actually need an EIN.
So a business that's completely private, they might not need an EIN at all.
That's what the source material is suggesting.
Wow, this is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about employment taxes. Okay, so what if a business already has an EIN? Can they reverse that?
Yeah.
Can they get rid of it?
Well, the source material says it might be possible to cancel an EIN, to basically remove yourself from the definition of employer as it's laid out in the Internal Revenue Code.
Right.
But they do stress the importance of doing it correctly so it's actually effective.
It sounds like there are a lot of details involved. Anyone thinking about doing that should definitely consult with an expert.
Yeah, absolutely. Navigating all these legal arguments, it requires some careful thought. You really got to understand the laws and the regulations.
For sure. So we've covered FICA and FUTA, how those taxes might be limited to certain areas, and we've talked about what this could mean for businesses. But what does all this mean for the average person, the average business owner? What should they take away from all this? How should they approach this information?
That's the big question, isn't it? And that's actually what we'll be discussing in the final part of this deep dive. We'll get into the practical implications of all these arguments and what it could mean for your own financial decisions.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been having a really interesting conversation about employment taxes. Trying to figure out who's really obligated to pay them.
Right. We've looked at some different interpretations of withholding, FICA, FUTA, and, how these taxes might be more limited than a lot of folks realize.
Yeah, we've covered a lot. It's complex stuff. But I think the big question now is, what does all this mean for our listeners? Like, if these interpretations of the law are actually correct, how can people use this in their own lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really the heart of the matter. The source material, it emphasizes that you need to understand your own personal tax liability. Don't just assume that you're automatically obligated to, participate in withholding or pay certain taxes without really considering the legal reasons why.
So don't just blindly trust what's on your pay stub or believe everything you've always been told about taxes.
Right. You got to dig deeper. You got to understand the why behind it all.
And this goes back to that whole idea of volunteering into jurisdiction. Like, we really need to pay attention to how our actions, even things like sharing our Social Security number, how those things could be affecting our tax obligations without us even realizing it.
Exactly. You've got it. It's about making informed decisions. When you really understand how these employment tax laws work, all the little details, then you're in a better position to make choices that, line up with how you interpret the law and maybe even minimize how much you owe in taxes.
So knowledge really is power when it comes to taxes. The more we know, the better off we are.
I think that's true. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the source material, it's presenting one interpretation of these laws. It's important to talk to a tax professional, someone qualified, to get advice for your specific situation and make sure you're meeting your obligations.
That's a good point. This has been a really interesting deep dive for me. It's made me think about things differently, that's for sure. And it's made me realize there's a lot more to these employment taxes than meets the eye.
Yeah, that's what I love about these conversations. Questioning those assumptions and really getting into the weeds of complex topics, it opens up whole new perspectives, and it helps us take control of our own finances.
Well said. This has been a fascinating look at the world of employment taxes. Hopefully you all found it helpful and empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, and challenging the way we think about things, that's so important when it comes to navigating this complex world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep diving deep.